That's leaking money, and obviously they don't want to do that. The next thing he'd have to do was build a berm all the way around his tank to contain a spill if all of the diesel fuel came out of it. This would be expensive and difficult to operate.
Senator's time has expired.
I would ask unanimous consent if I could have just 3 more minutes and conclude this.
Is there objection? Without objection.
And finally, Keith would have to hire and pay a professional engineer to certify his spill plan if he can find one. Now, in Oklahoma, farmers can't find professional engineers because they're all working for oil and gas companies, which makes compliance of this particular requirement virtually impossible. All told, Keith would have to pay somewhere between $10,000 and $30,000 to comply with the rule, and the environment is not any better for it. After we secured the amendment prohibiting the EPA from enforcing the rule back in March, Senator Pryor and I worked to secure a permanent exemption for, and we did this. We put it in, as the senator from California will remember, into the WRDA bill. And of course, it's not final law yet, and this is the dilemma that we have right now. Last month, during the August recess, I received word from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association that producers in Kansas and other areas out west were hearing from the EPA enforcement officers that they were at risk of having the SBCC rule retroactively enforced against them once the prohibition was enforced. It expired on the September 23rd. So this comes despite the clear actions of Congress that has been taken to provide relief for farmers. And I honestly don't know of anyone who wants to subject our farmers in the United States of America to the same requirements that refineries and the oil companies in these operations have. So I do have an amendment that would go on. It's my hope that we'll be able to get to the amendments on the bill, the underlying bill that's under consideration today. And I think this is one of 2 amendments I have that should be accepted unanimously. With that, I thank the senator from California for giving me that additional time, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, first I want to add my voice of condolence to that of Senator Murray's and say to the Navy family how heavy our hearts are, and that I stand ready any minute, any hour, any second to work with my colleagues to make sure that mentally ill people don't get their hands on weapons. And as soon as we can get a breakthrough on that, and maybe on background checks, maybe we can finally do something for 90% of the American people that want us to. I also want to note that Senator Inhofe and I have an ongoing dispute, though it is quite friendly, on climate change. And we went through this morning. He sees evidence that climate change is probably still a hoax, and he talks about the great news that we don't have climate change. I think you should tell that to the people in Colorado, but notwithstanding that, forget that. I will ask unanimous consent to place in the record 3 articles that appeared in the recent days about how the consensus on climate change is growing, and there's 95% certainty that the cause is human activity. And
without objection.
I want to ask Senator Durbin how much time he needs, and I'll make a request that he be...
Mr. President, I thank the gentlelady from California.
Not the gentlelady anymore, you know.
Pardon me?
Remember 10 years of being the gentlelady.
Well, I still think she's a gentlelady, in addition to being the senator from California. And I would say I've seen on the floor the senator from Wisconsin. I don't want to step in front of him. All right, then I ask for unanimous consent to speak, be given 5 minutes to speak after the senator from California.
Without objection. It's ordered.
Okay. I want to talk about what's happening in this Congress, or better yet, what's not happening. We have to pass a continuing resolution so we can fund this government. That means all the functions, whether it's air traffic controllers, whether it's building our highways, whether it's FBI agents, whether it's paying Social Security, all the things that we do, Medicare, we have to pass a continuing resolution to keep this government going, sending meat inspectors out to make sure we don't get poisoned and the rest, you name it. And where is the House? All spending bills have to start over there. The Republicans control it. They have not sent us a continuing resolution. We also have to make sure that we pay our debts, just like all Americans. Debts that we voted for, whether it's military spending, domestic spending, spending to help our farmers, spending to help recover from Hurricane Sandy, we have to pay our debts. And to do that, we have to increase the debt ceiling. October 15th, it's coming. If we don't do it, if the Republicans play games, we'll see a crash in the stock market. I'm sure every American looks forward to that. They're not doing their work because they're obsessed. They're obsessed with repealing a law they have tried to repeal for 41 times. They're obsessed. They tried to get it overturned in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said it's constitutional. They're trying to take away a law that is helping every American. And I'm going to talk about it. They're obsessed. And they refuse to understand that raising the debt ceiling is not about future spending, it's about past spending. So their reason is they're very upset about the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, however you want to call it, and they're very upset about the deficit, which has come down by half from its height with this president's leadership. So here's the thing. I do a lot of speaking to youngsters in school. And when I explain to them what the role of a senator is, I say, in essence, it's to make life better for the people. That's what I think it is, and to do it in a smart way. And to work with your colleagues to make sure you can compromise and get things done. Whether it's building highways or making sure our ports are dredged or funding the military, we must work together. No one gets everything he or she wants. That's life. You have to compromise. You can't be an ideologue and say, my way or the highway. And to go after a law that was passed years ago, that you tried to repeal 41 times and failed, that you tried to overturn in the court and failed, and then not to do your most fundamental responsibility of keeping the government open? There's something really wrong about this. Now, let's take a look at this economy. Why are they so upset at what the president has been able to achieve? President Clinton left office with a surplus, over $200 billion. Remember that. 8 years later, President Bush left office with a $1.3 trillion deficit. I won't go into why, because I don't have the time, but that's the fact, and no one can erase it from the books. Since President Obama took office, the annual deficit has been cut in half. It's less than $650 billion. And yet they're willing to shut the government down by making believe no progress has been made when we have cut the deficit in half. And we're trying to get out of a disastrous recession. Under the Clinton administration, the economy created more than 20 million private sector jobs. Under George W. Bush, we lost 665,000 jobs. Remember, Clinton, millions of jobs created. George Bush, the Republicans, hundreds of thousands of private sector jobs lost. And under Obama, we've added 3.9 million private sector jobs, coming out of the worst recession since the Great Depression. You can say what you want, but President Obama and the Democrats here, even though it has been a bear to do it, we've managed to wrap our arms around this recession and get us on a course. Now, how about housing? Home prices are up more than 12% over the last year. Home sales have increased 47% since their crisis low. Recent housing starts are up 75% from April '09. Housing was the cause of this recession. People sliced and diced mortgages and sold them on Wall Street and brought everything down. Deregulation, that was the Republican mantra. It went too far, and we lost our way, and people suffered through the worst recession since the Great Depression. The Republicans, instead of working with us to keep the progress up, want to shut the government down, want to say we're not going to pay our bills, even though they voted to rack up those bills. Look at the auto industry. In 2009, the auto industry lost more than 100,000 jobs. Rescuing the auto industry saved more than 1 million jobs, and the news is great coming out of Detroit. People are buying cars. The Republicans put it all at risk by shutting down the government and not paying the bills. There are going to be no more bailouts. I was so proud. I offered the First Amendment. I think my friend remembers. No more government bailouts of the big banks. So we're on our way to saying once and for all, we're not going to let this crisis happen again. The stock market. Do you know the Dow fell to 6,500, Mr. President? Since then, it's rebounded to 15,000. 2,000 points. But yet they'll put it all at risk because they're saying they're going to play games, shut down the government, not pay the debt. The last time they played these games, the Republicans, GAO found that threatening to breach the debt limit cost the Treasury $1 billion just in 2011, and over the years, $18 billion over the next 10 years. The next time a Republican tells you how fiscally conservative they are, ask them why it is they added $18 billion to the debt by playing games with the debt ceiling. I want to quote Republican President Ronald Reagan, one of the heroes of my friend's party. He said the full consequences of a default, or even the serious prospect of a default by the United States, are impossible to predict and awesome to contemplate. Denigration of the full faith and credit of the U.S. would have substantial effects on the domestic financial markets and the value of the dollar. That's Ronald Reagan. In 1983, he said even talking about a default has terrible consequences. They're not even talking about a default. They're planning for a default. My friend, who is such a great leader in the Senate, Senator Durbin, you informed us, and Senator Reid informed us, that the Republicans in the House have a bill that they love. We call it Pay China First. If there's a default, they'll keep paying China the interest we owe them, but they'll default on all the Americans here and all the contractors, the highway contractors, the people who dredge our ports. They'll default on what they owe the American people, but they'll pay China. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, the CBO director under George W. Bush, said, default, it's a bad idea. Little defaults, big defaults, default's a bad idea, period, and there should be no one who believes otherwise. He said that in 2011. There's no good thing as a good default. Now, I've shown you how far we've come with this economy. If we don't have the far right of the Republican Party taking America's country hostage, we'll continue to grow this economy. But if they play games and try to shut down this government, it could all turn around. If they play games and they try to default on the debt, they could turn it all around in a bad way. And we'll see the results as Social Security recipients start to worry, as Medicare recipients start to worry, as contractors start to worry, as federal FBI agents can no longer get paid, and it goes on and on and on. Now, one of the reasons they're so crazed is they are obsessed over the Affordable Care Act, which they call Obamacare. Now, I want to, in my time, tell you what the Affordable Care Act does, and see whether you think it's worth shutting down the government over this bill. They tried it 41 times, but 42 they hope will be their winner. Over 1 million Californians, this is just in my state, are already newly insured. 3 million young adults are now insured through their parents' plans in this nation of ours. 3 million are now insured. 400,000 in my state. 71 million Americans are getting free preventative care like checkups and birth control and immunizations. They don't like that, I guess. They're willing to shut the government down over it. 17 million kids with pre-existing conditions like asthma can no longer be denied coverage. Insurers can't cancel your health insurance because you get sick. There are no more lifetime limits on coverage. And anyone who's had a catastrophic disease knows it's pretty easy to hit that cap. No more caps. No more caps in a year. No more lifetime caps. This is what they're so obsessed about, so they're willing to shut down the government to take away these benefits? Now, they all said, oh, health care costs are going to go up because of the Affordable Care Act. Well, guess what? Health care costs are growing at the slowest rate in over 50 years, Mr. President. Insurance companies now have to justify their hikes. Before, they just hiked your rates and they could do it with impunity. Now, insurers have to spend at least 80% of your premium on your medical care, not on overhead. They can't pocket the money. They have to spend it on health care. And 8.5 million Americans have received rebate checks from their insurance company because they were overcharged. Is that what the Republicans are so upset about? They're willing to shut down the government to take away these benefits from the people? Insurance companies can't deny coverage or charge more for pre-existing conditions. They can't charge women more than men. There's no more discrimination. And, again, in a single year, they can't impose dollar limits on you. So I'm going to say this. The Republicans are upset about the deficit. The deficit's been cut in half. I would ask for 3 additional minutes.
Sir, objection. It's ordered.
The House has voted 41 times to defund the Affordable Care Act. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Republican attorneys general, they lost. And they made it a centerpiece of the 2012 election. And they lost the presidential election. And now they're willing to shut down the government unless they get their way. So I would conclude by asking some rhetorical questions here. Why are the Republicans so obsessed with kicking young people off their parents' insurance? Why are the Republicans so obsessed with stopping preventive care like checkups and birth control and immunizations? Why are Republicans so obsessed with repealing benefits that guarantee insurance coverage for children and adults with pre-existing conditions? And why are they so obsessed with stopping 13 million people from getting insurance who never had the chance before? And why are they so obsessed with stopping 24 million people from getting insurance under the new state health exchanges? And why are they so obsessed with allowing an insurance company to cancel a policy the minute someone gets sick by stopping that practice? Why are they upset that we are stopping that practice? Why are they so obsessed when we say you can no longer have an annual dollar limit on benefits? Why do they want to change that? And why are they so obsessed with saying to insurance companies, you can't have lifetime limit on benefits? And why are they so obsessed that finally we stop discrimination against women? You know, being a woman was considered a pre-existing condition, honestly, and you had to pay twice as much as a man for your health care. And if you were a victim of some kind of spousal abuse, that was considered a pre-existing condition, and your rates went up, or maybe you never even got insurance. And I got to say, finally, why are they so obsessed about doing away with the Affordable Care Act when CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, says It will save, Mr. President, $109 billion over 10 years and over $1 trillion the following decade. I cannot answer these questions. All I can think of is it's politics. It's politics. I've been here a long time. I'm proud of it. I thank my people in California for allowing me to have this honor. There were many laws I didn't like. Believe me, I served with 5 presidents. I didn't agree with quite a couple of them, 2 or 3. But when I lost the battle, I didn't try to shut down the government. When I lost the battle, I didn't say we can't pay our debt. Oh, maybe I voted once or twice as a symbolic vote, but I knew that the votes were there. And so I would say to my friends, get over your obsession and proceed with your responsibilities to keep this government open. Forget about repealing a health care law that's about to kick in that's good for the people, and pay your debts. Thank you very much. I yield the floor.
President.
The system majority leader is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise to thank a good friend for his service to our nation, America's soldiers, and their families. Tom Lamont of Springfield, Illinois, is retiring this week as Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, the Army's top personnel officer. It's a post that Tom has held for more than 4 years. These were not 4 ordinary years. They were 4 of the most challenging years in the Army's modern history. The list of challenges that Tom Lamont faced from day one was daunting. At the top of his list, he had to help coordinate the drawdown of U.S. troops from Iraq. At the same time, he had to support a surge of troops in Afghanistan and then help the return home of those same troops. He also had to address many of the most important issues facing the military and our Army today, including post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injuries, sexual assault in the military, and the disturbingly high incidence of suicide among active duty soldiers and veterans. I was proud to introduce Tom Lamont at his confirmation hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee 4 years ago. I said then that with the tremendous strain that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq had created for soldiers and their families, the Army needed a leader like Tom Lamont. As he prepares to complete his mission in the Pentagon, I'm proud, but not at all surprised, that Tom was every bit the leader that our Army needed. In the time of historic challenge for the United States Army, Assistant Secretary Thomas Lamont has consistently risen to the challenge. He made clear from the start that his #1 priority was the well-being of America's soldiers and their families, especially those coping with multiple deployments. He also supervised the development of the Army's first total force policy, a new policy that integrates the active duty, Guard, and Reserve components of the Army into a single, effective, unified force. It was signed by Secretary of Army John McHugh just last September. The new total force policy reflects a fundamental fact that as decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan have demonstrated, our Army, Guard, and Reserve are now as integral to the fight as the active duty component, and we are not going back. Very few people could bring to that task the experience and personal commitment that Tom Lamont did. Assistant Secretary Lamont also oversaw a review of the Army's integrated disability evaluation system. The IDES system is a partnership between the Defense Department and the Department of Veteran Affairs. It is used to evaluate the wounded, ill, or injured service members to determine whether they are fit for duty, and if not, what disability rating and benefits they receive. Thanks to Tom's focus, the Army's IDES wait times are down more than 40%, and the process more consistent, less adversarial. We need to cut back on that backlog even further, and we will. Tom Lamont's leadership over the last 4 years has made a real difference in reducing the so-called benefits gap for service members transitioning to civilian life. One reason that Tom has been such an effective Assistant Secretary of the Army is the respect he brought to this position from the sacrifices made by all soldiers, whether they are active duty, Guard, or Reserve. That respect is something Tom learned during his 25 years as a Judge Advocate General in the Illinois National Guard. He retired from the Guard with the rank of colonel in 2007. His years of experience in the Illinois Army National Guard gave Tom Lamont a deep understanding of the needs of the Army. Tom is also a respected attorney in our hometown of Springfield, Illinois, a former partner in 2 distinguished law firms. One of those firms, the Springfield firm of Brown, Hay & Stevens, is the oldest law practice in Illinois. From 1837 to 1841, it employed a young lawyer by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Later, in his second inaugural address, President Lincoln spoke of the solemn obligation of any nation that has been through a war. He said, "We have a moral responsibility, quote, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Tom Lamont has kept faith with that moral responsibility that Abraham Lincoln spoke to. Tom Lamont has also served the people of Illinois in many important positions: Executive Director of the Office of the State Attorney Appellate Prosecutor, Director of Civil Litigation in the Office of Illinois Attorney General, Executive Director of the Illinois Board of Higher Education, Special Counsel to the University of Illinois, member of the United States Senate Judicial Nomination Commission. A while back, General Martin Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, gave a speech in which he described the historic challenges facing the U.S. Armed Forces. He said in those remarks that, quote, "If we don't get the people right, the rest of it won't matter." He went on to say, "We might get the equipment right, the organization design right, modernization right, but if we don't get the people right, we're going to put the country at risk." When President Obama nominated Tom Lamont to be Assistant Secretary of the Army, he got the people right. His service these last 4 years leaves our Army stronger and better prepared for what lies ahead. In closing, I want to thank Tom for his extraordinary record of public service. Tom and his wife Bridget are good friends of Loretta's and mine. I know better than most the personal sacrifice they both have made so that Tom could serve this President, the United States Army, and the nation that he loves. I wish Tom and Bridget the best in life's next challenge. Mr. President, how much time do I have remaining?
Senator's time has expired.
I asked for 3 additional minutes if the Senator...
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I'd like to have this statement put separate in the congressional record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I want to salute my colleague from California, Senator Boxer. The statement that she made before I spoke really summarized what we face. People say to me, "Are you really going to shut down the government? Is that what you were elected to do? To come here and be unable to reach an agreement between the parties, between the House and the Senate, and to shut down the government, to cut off the basic services of the government of the United States of America, the leading nation in the world when it comes to striving for social justice as well as peace? Are you going to shut down the government? Is that the best you can do in this Congress?" The answer is, it is not worthy of this great institution or this great nation for us to entertain the thought of shutting down this government, or even worse, to default on America's debt for the first time in our history. People don't understand this term debt ceiling. Let me explain it. Do you have a mortgage on your home? What would happen if you didn't make a payment next month? Well, you might get by with it, but by the second month there'd be a knock on the door or a call or an email, and they'd be saying to you, "You know, you missed your payment, and if you want to stay in this house, you better make it." Well, even if you made that payment, the next time you negotiate a mortgage, someone will remember you defaulted. You failed to pay your mortgage, and you're likely to pay a higher interest rate. Now, translate that into the United States of America. If we don't pay our mortgage, if we don't lift the debt ceiling to reflect spending that this Congress is already engaged in by both political parties, we will in fact have defaulted on America's debt for the first time in history. We may get through it, I'm sure we will, but at the end of the day, what will happen? The interest rate paid by Americans to borrow money will go up. It means that a dollar sent to Washington in taxes will no longer buy a dollar's worth of goods and services. No, it'll buy less because more has to be paid in interest to someone loaning money to the United States. Golly, it's an awful outcome. Wish we could avoid it. The answer is we can't avoid it. The default on America's debt, the failure to extend the debt ceiling, is a self-imposed crisis generated, sadly, by the majority in the House of Representatives who happen to believe this is good politics. The American people will just rally to the notion that we're going to default on our debt for the first time and we're going to stop funding the government. What a glorious day for this great nation. Closing the doors of our government in every single agency, virtually every agency, and defaulting on our debt for the first time in history. If that is what the Tea Party Republicans think is leadership, God save the United States of America. We need leadership where Democrats and Republicans sit down and act like adults, not like squealing political pigs trying to get attention. We need to basically sit down in both political parties and solve this problem. I've been waiting patiently, watching as we've asked for a budget conference committee to work out our differences. Time and again we've come to the floor over the last 6 months and said Senator Murray's budget that passed the Senate is ready to be negotiated with the House. Consistently, 4 senators on the Republican side of the aisle have taken turns standing up and objecting to working out our differences and coming up with an agreement on how much we'll spend. That's not how you should govern this nation. I don't believe that's how you should serve in the Senate. The latest excuse, and I won't go into detail, is the Republicans have said, of course, we have to shut down the government, and we have to default on our debt for the first time in history to stop Obamacare. Senator from California, Senator Boxer, went through the details of what Obamacare means to millions of families and the opportunity for health insurance for the first time for many of them in their entire lives. It's working, and I think that's what infuriates many Republicans the most. We can fix it. It can be better. We should do it. But to bring this government to a halt and to default on our debt over this question of a bill that passed over 3 years ago and is the law of the land found constitutional by the Supreme Court, that is the height of irresponsibility. The American people have a right to be angry at Congress, but please take a moment and realize that this desperate, awful strategy is inspired by one political party who thinks that somehow this is going to appeal to the American people. I don't believe it will. The American people are too smart to fall for that one. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I sat through the speech given by the junior senator from California, and I have a long list of things with which I disagree, and I'm going to get to as many of those as I can in a minute, but I feel an obligation to make a statement about some foreign policy issues that nobody talks about. It's certainly not partisan in any way. So I'd like to get that kind of out of the way first. Then I'll have time on the time that I have been given to go back and cover as many of the issues that were misrepresented by my good friend, the junior senator from California. Today, I want to encourage the Obama administration to review its current policies regarding the country of Sri Lanka and seek further engagement to assist them as they continue their progress toward reconciliation and reconstruction after 30 years of a bloody civil war against the Tamil Tiger terrorists. Just 4 years ago, Sri Lanka defeated the Tamil terrorists and is currently recovering from economic, political, and social upheaval caused by the destructive civil war. I think a lot of people didn't expect this to happen with this new administration, but it is. Good things have happened. Peace has brought historic post-conflict recovery, and Sri Lanka is bringing the dividends of peace in an exclusive manner, and particularly to those in the north and to the east of the country from where Tamil suicide bombers and other terrorist attacks were once launched. Specifically, since the war ended, those two areas have seen an economic growth of 22% compared to an average of 7.5% in the rest of the country. Sri Lanka has removed 500,000 anti-personnel mines, resettled 300,000 internally displaced people, and reestablished vital social services in the areas of health and education. It is also conducting local elections in the formerly Tamil-controlled north on I think it's the 21st of September, they'll be having these elections. I see this as an important step toward the political reconciliation, such as processes take time, as we have learned from our own civil war. Now, it seems to me that Sri Lanka is developing into a key economy, both in its own right and as a gateway to India. A lot of people don't know where Sri Lanka is. It's at that little point at the bottom of India and that part of the world. And Sri Lanka's geostrategic location, the deepwater ports could be vital to the long-term financial and national security interests of the United States. You know, we want them on our side. Some 50% of all container traffic, for example, and 70% of the world's energy supplies pass within sight of Sri Lanka's coast. U.S. diplomatic efforts there, however, have lagged, and as a result, I believe our long-term economic and national security interests are suffering at a time when the United States is pivoting or rebalancing toward Asia. We may be given this island nation reason not to consider the United States a friend and strategic power. Understandably, the United States policies towards Sri Lanka have focused on accountability for what happened during the last phases of the Civil War, as well as on steps toward political reconciliation and respect for human rights. While these aspects are very important and deserve of support, I also believe there is an opportunity to engage in a wider, simultaneous approach that also takes into account economic and national security considerations. Maybe this wider and dual-track approach would have a positive influence overall and make up for lost grounds. I've expressed these views in letters to both Secretaries Kerry and Hagel in recent months, and while both agree with me about Sri Lanka and their economic and geostrategic importance to the United States, both still point to the lack of political transparency and poor human rights record to reject a review of the administration's position, which restricts military-to-military relations and foreign assistance funding. I take Secretaries Kerry and Hagel at their word and believe that the upcoming September 21st provincial council elections in the North can be a meaningful act of political reconciliation, but would be between the Sinhala majority and the Tamil minorities. And if they are conducted in a free and fair manner, free of human rights violations, I will strongly renew my request to the administration to reassess our current policies toward Sri Lanka. I know it's a little bit controversial, but we've watched what's happened over the years over there. We watched the Civil War. And then when you consider the very strategic location of Sri Lanka, it's really important, in my view, that we establish these relationships and recognize them. Let me just mention just a few things that I took issue with. Some of them where I had a hard time understanding what the junior senator from California was talking about when she was singing the praises of this administration. First of all, I agreed with her on the tragedy at the Navy Yard. You know, I've been down there many times. And I was envisioning, as I was coming from Tulsa up here on Monday, the plane, at that time they said that Ronald Reagan Airport was going to be closed. They thought it was going to be closed down because of the proximity to the Navy Yard. Well, it didn't turn out that way, and we ended up landing there. But when I went down and I saw the scene, which I've seen many times before, and I looked at it, it's just gut-wrenching to think that one deranged person could do this. We saw it before in Waco. We've seen it in Boston. We've seen it other places. And it's something that I assume is going to be with us. I don't know how it can be precluded. I will say this, though. I fully expected several of my liberal friends to try to use that as an excuse to come up with some more stringent gun regulations. I would only suggest, Mr. President, that the District of Columbia has the most stringent anti-Second Amendment gun control laws anywhere in the country. And that's where this took place. So you can't really say this has anything to do, but I knew it was going to happen. Another thing that my friend talked about was the debt and all of this, talking about the different administrations. I would only remind you, Mr. President, and this is something that's incontrovertible, The amount of debt that this president has had in his, well, up to today, he has increased our deficit by $6.1 trillion, which is more than all of the other presidents from George Washington on up through recent administrations combined. And you wonder where is all that money? Where did it all go? It went to his social programs. My major concern, you may, Mr. President, have heard that I was making quite an issue out of the fact that the president wanted to send cruise missiles into Syria. I don't think there's anyone naive enough to believe that you can do that and not get repercussions. We heard from Iran, which I consider to be the greatest threat to the United States, in that our intelligence has told us since 2007 that Iran would have the nuclear weapon and the delivery system in place by 2015. That's a year and a half from now. So, yeah, it is something where we would be going in. However, in the disarming of America, as I've referred to, I remember going to Afghanistan back 4.5 years ago. That was after the president's first budget. I went there because I knew what was going to happen to the military. In spite of all this spending that has given us all this new debt, $6.1 trillion. Where did it go? We can't. I can tell you a lot of places where it didn't go, and it didn't go to defending America. So I went over there, and that very first budget that the president had, the first thing he did was do away with our only fifth-generation fighter, the F-22, did away with our lift capability, the C-17, did away with our future combat system, the only advancement of ground capability in some 60 years, did away with the ground-based interceptor in Poland, which now puts us in a position where we're hustling all over trying to figure out where we can get a third site to protect the United States of America against a missile coming in from the east. You know, we have 33 of them out there, but they're all on the West Coast. That doesn't help us here. So anyway, and on top of that, this administration in his extended budget has now taken already $487 billion out of our defense budget and is talking about another $500 billion through his sequestration. Now, I know nobody believes this, and that's why none of the members on this floor will talk about it. But this disarming of America puts us in a very serious problem. And I think when the junior senator was praising this president and all of his the things that she felt he's been doing, it's time to hear the truth. She was praising him on Obamacare, how wonderful this is and how thankful everyone is. Well, why is it that the most recent polling showed that 88% of the people of America want to do away with the individual mandate, and the vast majority of them say that it's just a bad idea. That's the word that they say for it. So it's not working. I can remember back when we were going to have Hillary health care. This is back during the Clinton administration. And you ask the question. You know, you ask any liberal who wants to get to a single payer or ultimately have socialized medicine, which I think would be down the road in the vision of this administration. You say, well, wait a minute. If this hasn't worked in Great Britain, it hasn't worked in Denmark, it hasn't worked in Canada, why would it work here? Now, they'll never tell you this, but they're saying if they were running it, it would work here. So anyway, this is something that is not popular, as was misrepresented by the junior senator from California. And then when she said, news is great coming out of Detroit, that's a quote. That's fine, except they filed bankruptcy last week. And then, so when you look at all the things that were stated, just keep in mind, this is still America. We still have certain values that have been completely reversed by this administration. It's time to keep that in mind and to move on ahead. And with that, Mr. President, I will yield the floor.
Senior senator from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I rise this afternoon to talk about two overarching issues that are confronting the United States Senate and the House at the same time. Both, unfortunately, in this circumstance, are directly related. Normally, we would talk about these two issues separate and apart. First of all, the Affordable Care Act and what that means for the country, what it means for families, the impact it's having now in a very positive way, but also what it means for those families in the future, and also the concerns that I have about what a small group, but a very powerful group in the United States Congress want to do that I would argue would adversely impact the economy. So let me talk first about the Affordable Care Act. I was a strong supporter, worked hard for its passage, and will continue to work hard on the implementation. We have seen in the last couple of years, since implementation began in 2010, continued in 2011, 12, and 13, the benefits that the Affordable Care Act has brought to the United States of America. We've also seen where we've had to make changes, where we've had to come together, often in a bipartisan manner, to make changes to the legislation to make it work. And there will be plenty of other changes in the future. But the worst thing we could do right now is to pretend, as some in this body and in the other body do as well, and that is to pretend that nothing has changed for the better for families. Let me just give a couple of examples. I'll use Pennsylvania examples, but of course in every one of these there's a national number that corresponds to the state-by-state numbers. But just consider this. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, 222,703 Pennsylvania seniors save money on prescription drugs directly as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Health reform provides seniors who hit the so-called donut hole with more than a 50% discount on brand-name drugs. So already, just in Pennsylvania, that many seniors have had some measure of support when they get into that donut hole. That's a very nice way of saying a coverage gap where they have to come up with the dollars for prescription drugs. That has saved, I mentioned the number of 222,000 seniors in Pennsylvania, but that has already saved them $168 million on prescription drugs directly as a result of this legislation. So if you're for repealing this, you got to tell us how you're going to help those 222,703 Pennsylvanians with their prescription drug coverage, if you want to take away that benefit. Two more examples, and I won't go through all of these. 5,489,162 Pennsylvanians with pre-existing conditions will no longer have to worry about being denied coverage. Now, that part of the legislation, as the presiding officer knows so well, is an enlargement of what we had before. What we had in the first couple of years of implementation was a legal prohibition that a child who had a pre-existing condition would not be denied coverage. But just imagine where we were before this legislation. We were saying, the federal government and the nation really was saying to those families, we know your child has coverage. We know you're paying the premium for that child. We know that technically your child has some kind of health insurance coverage, but if that child has a pre-existing condition, he or she does not get covered. That was the prevailing policy before the Affordable Care Act was passed. What we said in the Act was that is unacceptable. The United States of America is not going to say any longer to a child, if you have or say to the family, if your child has a pre-existing condition, he or she will be denied coverage and treatment. So we wiped that out by virtue of passage of the Act and then implementation. Now we're saying, as implementation proceeds in 2014, that same kind of coverage for pre-existing conditions will apply to adults as well. We couldn't afford to do it right away. Now we're able to move in that direction. But just imagine what happens upon repeal. If you repeal the Affordable Care Act, we go back to the old, and I would argue very dark days, where children with pre-existing conditions and adults with pre-existing conditions don't get the coverage that they need and surely deserve. What kind of a country are we if we say that a child whose parents have health insurance and they've been paying premiums, we're saying that that child should not be covered or treated because an insurance company says that they're not entitled to coverage? If you repeal the bill, we're going back to those days. So whether it's a child or an adult, the least that we can do is to say that we will have a health insurance system in the United States of America that if you are paying your premiums, that you will be given the coverage that you're paying for and that you're entitled to. We could say that before the passage of this act. So repeal affordable health coverage, pre-existing conditions are no longer covered. And I haven't heard a lot from the other side about how they would achieve that. Maybe they will. Maybe they'll come up with a plan to do that. Finally, this is the third example. 91,000 young Pennsylvanians have been able to find health coverage. Under the Act, young adults ages 19 to 25 are able to stay on their parents' plan in order to maintain coverage. A lot of families out there who had a lot of worry and, frankly, a lot of financial burden, but especially the anxiety of knowing that a young person who may have been in college years or maybe they went to had a 2-year college education or a 4-year education, but somewhere in that time period of being in college, roughly that age, and after college up through age 25, have no coverage. This has solved that problem. Just imagine the numbers across the country. In both of these instances, young people having coverage on their parents' plans, children being covered by getting coverage for pre-existing conditions. You're talking in the tens of millions of Americans here, children and young adults. So they're just three examples. Just three examples. Seniors getting help with their prescription drug coverage, which they never got before, this level of protection and help. Children with pre-existing conditions, now adults. And then thirdly, young people across the country. So, Mr. President, I will submit for the record and ask that it be included as part of my remarks a summary entitled, The Affordable Care Act is Providing Stability and Security for Middle-Class Pennsylvanians.
Without objection, so ordered.
Make that part of the record. There's a lot more we could talk about, but we don't have time. And I won't go into the national numbers. I know others have done that. But this is just some of the examples of what this legislation has meant. Now, the act is not perfect. No act that's been passed by the Senate ever has been perfect, especially something as challenging as health care. And we'll make changes to make it work. But the worst thing we could do is for the United States Senate to turn its back on children and say you don't deserve to have coverage if you have a pre-existing condition, or turn our back on older citizens who fought our wars, worked in our factories, taught our children, gave us a middle class, and gave us, in younger generations, life and love, and help us in so many ways, to say to them, you know what, you can be on your own when it comes to prescription drug coverage. So that's the Affordable Care Act, but unfortunately this isn't just a debate about the act. Now we're getting into a debate about some people in Washington wanting to use the Affordable Care Act as a political weapon in other contexts, to say that if they don't have a repeal of or a defunding of the Affordable Care Act, that somehow they think a government shutdown would be the right way to go, or that we would default on our obligations. We, of course, I, of course, and many others don't believe that's the right way to go. In essence, in the case of the debt limit, holding the debt limit hostage to a relitigation of the Affordable Care Act. That is dangerous for the economy, but I think it's also very bad for those families that I just mentioned. This debt limit crisis, which is ahead of us, just like the end of the fiscal year crisis is ahead of us, is manufactured. We don't need to have a crisis on the debt ceiling, but it's being manufactured to make a political point by some in Washington. Not all Republicans agree with this. Certainly not around the country, but even here in Washington. But some seem to believe this is the right way to go. So this is the kind of edge-of-the-cliff brinksmanship that we saw in 2011, which had a substantially, and I think this is irrefutable, adverse impact on the economy. The Dow dropped 2,000 points because of the last debt ceiling debate, a debate which resulted in us getting an agreement at the very last minute, not going over the deadline, but some apparently think it's a good idea to default on our obligations for the first time since 1789. So what does that mean for most Americans? Well, you have the Dow drop 2,000 points or maybe higher if you actually go over the deadline. That means lost savings for Americans. Now, it may not affect people in the Senate who are wealthy or people in the Senate who have job security and health care security and everything else, but it'll hurt a lot of Americans, and it will crater the savings of Americans if that happens. An adverse credit rating is another adverse consequence. That means more expensive credit for everyone. It translates into higher costs for housing, education, and other critical household expenses. Local governments would also bear the burden of a higher credit rating, or I should say a lower credit rating and a drop in credit ratings in the United States, which makes every project that much more difficult and expensive. I was struck by an article, and Mr. President, I'll put this article in the record. This is the Wall Street Journal op-ed entitled "Uncertainty is the Enemy of Recovery," dated April the 28th, 2013, written by Bill McNabb, the CEO of Vanguard. I just asked that that be included in the record. Mr. President, I won't read it, obviously, but he talks about this problem of uncertainty, which has many causes. One of the measures of uncertainty that was calculated as part of, or to support this op-ed, was done by two economists. And here's what they concluded, just as it relates to the uncertainty that results from a debt ceiling battle. He said, and I'm quoting, "At Vanguard, we estimate that the spike in policy uncertainty surrounding the debt ceiling debate alone, not to mention other, and these are my words, not to mention other reasons for uncertainty, but surrounding the debt ceiling debate alone has resulted in a cumulative economic loss of $112 billion over the past 2 years," unquote. This is what Bill McNabb, someone who knows something about markets and all these related issues, that's what he said in April of this year. So a 2-year impact of $112 billion because of a politically motivated and manufactured crisis, because some people want to make a political statement about the debt ceiling, which puts the economy at risk. So that's what we're talking about here, and I hope that some folks come to their senses, because we can have debates about, and should have debates about, reducing spending, about how to do that, how to do it in a bipartisan fashion, how to reduce spending like a business does, how to reduce spending like a family does. But does it make any sense to do this kind of high wire act? And this is very dangerous for the economy. And this isn't theoretical. We had a dry run, unfortunately. We had a rehearsal of this, if you want to say that, in 2011, where we didn't go over the line. We didn't default, but we came very close. We came within days of defaulting. That alone, getting close to that alone, had an adverse impact on the economy. So to say this is fiscally reckless is a vast understatement. I don't know how you express it beyond saying that. To say that it's dangerous for the economy, for jobs, for families, for the middle class, for companies all over the country, to say that defaulting on our obligations, or coming close to that, or playing with fire in a sense, to say that that's dangerous is an understatement. Here's what we should do, and I'll conclude with this, Mr. President. I know I'm over time. Here's what we should do. We should stop the games in the fiscal high wire act, and we should focus on what middle-class families want us to focus on. When I go home in Pennsylvania, they say to me in a couple of short words what they want me to do and want all of us to do. They say, work together to create jobs. Work together to create the conditions for growth, whether that's tax credits or tax policy, whether it's efforts to jumpstart the economy. And one of the more depressing, if I can use that word, charts I've seen in 6 months or maybe even 6 years is a chart that was in the New York Times, and I'll put this in the record. It's called Shifting Economic Tide, New York Times, July 25th, 2013. I just put that on the record, Mr. President, and that depicts, and I won't hold it up because you won't be able to see it, but here's what it depicts. The change in income from 1995, and it's a long line going up and down, spikes and then the line going down. But the two most relevant numbers here, the one comparison is between what has the top 1% done during the recession and then in the recovery. Well, the top 1% got hit pretty hard, like a lot of people did. Even the very wealthy got hit. They lost about a little more than 36% of their real income. But in the recovery, even though they lost 36%, they're up plus 11 in the recovery, okay? So they went down by minus 36, but they're up plus 11. Still not back yet. But what happened to the bottom 90? Not the top 1%. What happened to the bottom 90%? Recession and recovery. Well, the bottom 90%, according to this chart in the New York Times, July 25th, the bottom 90% lost 12% of their real income, but they're still at minus 1.5. They haven't even gotten to zero. They haven't even gotten to a positive territory yet when you compare their real income in the recession, the hit they took, and where they are today. The bottom 90% of the country. So what does that mean for us? It means that both parties have a lot of work to do. It means that both parties should be working together to create more jobs, to create more economic certainty, instead of playing this game, which is dangerous, fiscally reckless for sure, and the record shows that, and very damaging to the economy and I think even the morale of the country. They want us to work together. They don't want us to play games like some want to play here. So, Mr. President, I know I went over time, but I appreciate the fact that we're having a debate about the Affordable Care Act. It's very important to have that debate, make sure we get the implementation right. But we should not be using, no one here should be using the Affordable Care Act as a political weapon in these debates about our fiscal policy. And I think we can do that in a rational way as long as people are willing to set aside their political ideology for a short period of time so we can resolve some of these issues. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.